Okay, we are rolling. Thank you.
Okay. So my proposal focused on capturing the carbon emissions from the new building that's going up, the Center for the Molecular and Life Sciences. So as you can read, it will emit roughly 5,761 metric tons of carbon over its lifespan.
Wow.
That's pretty unexpected. But this estimate is based off of a study I found called Carbon Neutrality, based on native site carbon storage. And they basically examined buildings in Florida and made a formula that uses the average utilities of a Florida building. So I basically had to input the square footage of this building to get this estimate. So I would note that this is going to be a LEED certified building, so the emissions will probably be a little bit less than 5,000 tons. So that estimate does include construction emissions from sources like construction equipment, which emits 22% of the nation's nitrous oxide. It also includes concrete manufacture, which I found out concrete manufacture causes 5% of global CO2 emissions, so that's another big problem. And then that estimate also includes the utilities of a 100-year lifespan. I don't know how long the college is going to be around, but we'll go ahead and assume that the building's going to run for 100 years.
Sea level rise.
Sustainable development. So my proposal is to hopefully capture the carbon from this building by planting the most effective trees possible to capture that carbon in the area that has just been left blank. This is where Old Mount Eckerd was, and then there's a field over here as well. So just sort of measuring this out using Google Maps, I figured out it's about 2 hectares, give or take. So a few things about my carbon sequestration plan. The first is that after the trees are planted, there can be no carbon export, so we basically treat it like the Palm Hammock Nature Area. I figured out that, well, I should say studies show that carbon storage occurs through accumulation of organic matter. So it first happens in the tree, but then as the leaves and the branches fall off and they become part of the soil, the carbon is also stored there. So to take that out causes an initial release of carbon. So I think it would be better if we just had zero carbon export once this was planted. So I chose nitrogen fixing plants. One study that I read found that carbon storage is 55% greater under nitrogen fixing plants. Leguminous trees, or bean producing trees, fix nitrogen through symbiosis with rhizobium bacteria in their roots. And sweet acacia is a native leguminous tree, so I chose sweet acacia as the species that would be planted here. Unfortunately, trees are not cheap, so I found one site, the Florida Native Plants Nursery in Sarasota, Florida, had a pretty reasonable price. It was about $20 per medium-sized tree, and I went for the medium-sized tree over the cheaper, smaller ones because I thought they're a little more established and they'd probably do a better job growing. But since they're $20 per tree, I'd say go ahead and spend the whole budget on 500 trees because I want this to be as effective as possible at grabbing carbon. And I'll talk about how we're gonna plant them and everything without labor costs. But 500 trees, and I propose that they're planted 2 by 2 meters apart, just because that's what other studies used. There's like 3 or 4 studies, and all of the trees in all these studies were 2 by 2 meters apart in the stands. And so just for comparing ourselves to other studies, I thought it'd be reasonable to plant them at the same amount. So the initial planting is this little box right here, and it's about 0.2 hectares. But leguminous trees are very prolific. Their seeds are preferred by wild birds, so it's a pretty good chance that they would spread quite quickly through this area. And also, if we're just letting it grow naturally, I'm sure you would get cabbage, palmetto, and other native species coming through. So here are the results. So these are based off the carbon sequestration of nitrogen fixing trees, and I found that in a study that actually compared N-fixers to eucalyptus trees. So I included how much it would capture per meter per year, so that's 0.11 kilograms, which converts to 1.1 tons of carbon per hectare per year. So here's the initial planting. If it were just that 0.2 hectares that were left to sequester the carbon, it would take about 26,000 years. So hopefully it'll grow a little bit larger than that. And I also included how many tons of carbon it could sequester over 25 years, because that would be how long the pact for the palm hammocks is, and so we can guarantee that these trees will be planted for at least 25 years. So for that reason I included that. So 5.5 tons of carbon for 25 years. If the full 2 hectares were allowed to grow naturally, we could capture 2.2 tons per year. That way it would only take about 2,600 years to sequester the carbon from the center. And then in 25 years it could sequester 55 tons. Okay, you can go ahead to the next one. So because it does seem a little bit hopeless capturing all the carbon in just 2 hectares, I did want to point out some of the other benefits that we could get from planting these trees. So students could participate in independent studies where they could actually measure the carbon sequestration accomplished by the trees. And here's actually one of the input-output things that I used. So you can just see how carbon just sort of becomes part of the ecosystem, litter and branches, and then it becomes part of the soil, goes back into the atmosphere over and over again. So actually, the study that this came from was my main resource for figuring out how much carbon would be captured by the trees. So students could measure this carbon sequestration. They could use mass spectrometers to measure the amount of nitrogen in the soil as another way of studying how effective the trees are. And then I also mentioned there might be some impacts on wildlife. By adding this extra stand of trees, you may get a kind of corridor going from the palm hammock out to Indian Key or something like that. So students can measure the impact on wildlife. They could see if maybe there's more roadkill on the road now that we have a new stand of trees and things like that. So those are just some potentials for the education of my project. Oh, and I'll also mention, since I